People have said that the color of freedom is green. And one story is told, it's legendary, so we don't really know the origin of it or the truth of it, in fact. When Martin Luther King Jr., right after the Selma initiative, watched Lyndon Baines Johnson sign the Voting Rights Act, everybody jumped up in jubilation. Thank God. We got a Civil Rights Act, we got a Voting Rights Act. 5 or 6 days after the signing of the Voting Rights Act, Watts went up in smoke. Rebellion. Someone, it is alleged, picked up the telephone and called one, quote, civil rights leader and said, "This is insane. Why, after we have achieved such milestones, are black people rebelling?" And the response came, "It's one thing to be able to sit at the lunch counter, and it's yet another to be able to afford the hamburger." And so it seemed like from that point forward, I began to hear, and a lot of us began to hear, that the color of freedom is green. The next stage of the civil rights movement, human rights movement, is the economic movement. We must become empowered. We've got to get a piece of the rock. Freedom ain't free. And there were significant efforts made and some progress so that African Americans, through affirmative action, set-asides, quotas, were given significant pieces of government contracts. Corporations began to use their funds to develop subsidiaries with African Americans at the head, joint venture projects, and to a degree, some of the community development work that we see today is a result of saying use public money to create private wealth. Black mayors elected in Cleveland, in Seattle, New York, Chicago began, and you saw a development of these young investment bankers who were in the bond business, you know, and the lawyers that were in this business with municipal bonds and things of this nature, making money. But then in the face of all of that, we would buy homes in neighborhoods we couldn't go to before. We had offices with thick carpet. We ate in restaurants. Our children, because of the earlier battles, could go to the finer schools, and even if they didn't make the grade, which is what we had to do before we even had any hope of getting in, our parents could now pay the tuition. And then one of those very fine Ivy League educated, very fine, well-dressed corporate executives was stopped by a white police officer in New York and slapped around and called a nigger. All of a sudden, while the economic piece has its importance, it is not the total solution. And it will cause men and women to have a greater respect for you. But then at the same time that you have all of this economic, and I shouldn't say all of this economic, while you have some little bit of the pie, it hadn't really changed the balance of power, because when you see how much you have relative to what is really out there, you don't have anything. You have the crumbs, less than the crumbs. And so nobody respects you. And then people began to say, weren't we better off when we were segregated? At least we had our black Wall Streets in Oklahoma before it was burned to the ground by a bunch of savages. At least we had our own black community businesses. Now they're all gone for the most part. So to say that the political is more important than the economic is not right. To say that the economic is more important than the political is not right. They go hand in hand. And then we haven't even talked about the cultural. The political, I'm sorry, the politics without economics is symbol without substance. We are now aware that politicians change, but there's a permanent government of business women and men that remains in place. And they tend to pull the strings. And so therefore, the answer is not totally in economics, but it is a part of the answer that's very important. Lastly, economics is important. Money in America is certainly important. Whoever recently, since September 11, in God we trust has more meaning. Prior to that, it was an absolute lie. America didn't trust in God, they trusted in the dollar. And that dollar carries respect. So if you've got it, you got more respect than if you don't have it. But by itself, it's not liberating. And ask the young drug dealer who is selling drugs because he wants money. He gets money, but he doesn't have the respect that the bootlegger had. I mean, the bootlegger's son becomes president of the United States. The dope dealers and his son go to jail. How do the bootlegger's son is swimming and his girlfriend drowns. Nobody says anything about it. The dope dealer's son goes to jail. So money is not all of it. It's money connected to what? Connected to a cultural history, connected to influence, I mean, if you understand what I mean, you got money and you're making some dollars and you have much more respect, much more access than you ever had. But you really have money when you can buy an election, or you really have money when you can be friends with a terrorist one day and say either you're with him or you're with us on the next. Then you're talking about what money can do in America. And black people are not there. People of color are not there. Well, 1945, 1950, 1955, 1960, racism was obvious. It was the back of the bus. You couldn't sit at a lunch counter. Quotas worked in reverse. I mean, no blacks and very few other people, women or Jewish persons. But now, since the marching feet of the nonviolent army led by King brought the walls, if you will, of American apartheid crumbling down. People ran across the rubble, so African Americans, white women, Jewish persons, Latinos, and so we are at the lunch counter now. We are in the front of the bus. We are at corporate America, American Express, AOL, Time Warner. We sit at the top of these corporations. And we are in universities, maybe not in the numbers that we would want, but certainly more. And so white Americans, many of them, not all, view this as a level playing field. What are you upset about? Everything is right with the world. Let's all go forward. We're all equal. But that's not true. Racism now is endemic. It's amorphic. You can't see it as you once could in terms of the obvious colored signs over a drinking fountain or going to the balcony of a theater. It's institutionalized. It almost operates without the consent of the individual. And so therefore, when you are interviewing for a job, all the right questions are asked and the wrong ones are avoided, and yet you still don't get the job. And you wonder why. And it's because by the time you go through the system, a number of the people that you have to go through are employing all the right questions and avoiding the wrong ones, but they are white, and they have certain criteria that's kind of a personal prejudice that does not express itself on paper, or the institution itself because of the hierarchy. Take the police department in the city of New York. It's institutional racism. Because African Americans, for example, had difficulty getting in at the patrol officer level, the entry level. And the reasons that we have trouble getting in are linked to historic racism. No access to solid educational opportunities. The continuing failure of the public school system. And so therefore, when it comes time to take the exam, one, we did not know in the past that the exam was even being given. Two, we were not adequately prepared to take the exam, whereby the white exam takers or applicants had been prepared by their fathers and mothers. You know, there was a whole culture, and there is a culture that exists. And so therefore, no African Americans. When it comes time to talk about promotions, who are you promoting? And when it comes time to talk about promotions beyond just captains and sergeants, when it gets into the chief category, very few. And people say, well, no, we're not discriminating. We like black people. We don't hate black people. You're Martin Luther King, right on, brother. But we're not there. And they said, well, I'm not racist. And maybe you're not. But the system perpetuates the racism of the past, and it's not corrected. In the psychological exam, let's just stay with the police department. African Americans are squashed in that more than any other group. So a young African American recruit, she's passed all the exams, and she comes up and she takes the psychological, and they say, you fail. Based on what? I mean, you know, the psychology of an African American woman could be different from the psychology of a quote, white woman, particularly when you consider the historical context in which both grew up, the socioeconomic context. And so the questions that you ask on a psychological exam may be different for each one to determine whether or not they are adequately prepared to do police work. And so it's not as obvious as the back of the bus or a segregated lunch counter, but there it is. Healthcare, same kind of thing. Racism has so segregated, if you will, the healthcare system. It's an insidious form of apartheid, Jim Crow, such that even an African American who has health insurance, when he or she goes to the hospital to check in for a stomach ailment, they don't get the same care. Very often, the African American, particularly the African American man, will be treated by, you know, not staff physicians, but residents, you know, seen by newly trained doctors. Not saying there's anything wrong with the newly trained doctor, but one would think that the more experienced staff physicians would give maybe a more informed kind of care. These things are subtle. Many people can't see them, but they go on every day. The fire department, that's not only in New York, that's across the nation. And I'm not saying this without recognizing that the fire persons in September 11 tragedy ran into the building with no concern for color. They're not racist in their hearts. You know, they would save a black life as quickly as they would save a white life. But when you talk about the fire department and who the fire persons are, then you wonder, why aren't there more blacks? We're not racist, but the system perpetuates the racism. And therefore, corrective measures like affirmative action and quotas have been used, and they have worked. But now we're living in a climate where people are crying reverse racism. Well, I don't really see that. We haven't even really completely addressed the issue of racism against people of color. And people are saying, well, you know, we want to do, and have done away with in Texas and admissions in law school, in California, and have done away with affirmative action to the detriment of African Americans especially, and people of color generally. Declaration of Independence, we hadn't gotten beyond 3/5 of a human being. So in the minds of the founding fathers, slaves were not human. So they had no problem. And moreover, they had the ability, they had the thought pattern. I mean, Cotton Mather came back from England and said, you can baptize one of these non-humans, and they will still be non-human and chattel. That was the Church of England. And then you had the powerful aphrodisiac, money. You know, no matter how glorious your words are, no matter how lofty your thoughts are, you know, that money will make you, I mean, you know, it'll make, it'll make you do stuff that, how do you go in church on Sunday and pray to God and acknowledge, you know, the equality of humanity, or, you know, and then go out and deal in the marketplace, or, you know, go out of the back door of your home down to the slave quarters and sleep with your paramour, you know, black is Thomas Jefferson. You know? And so, you know, he recognizes the wealth and the comfort that comes from owning these non-humans, this chattel, and so why include them? You know, because all of his white colleagues are saying, you know, this is lofty, this is glorious, you know. And after I'm finished, you know, when I'm through living my life like this, then the rest of you guys. But don't ask me to give up my landed gentry status, you know, to advocate on behalf of these poor darkies. You know, money. Money will make you sell your mother, it'll make you kill your children, it'll make you do almost anything. And it's a rare individual. Jesus is my Lord. And one of the reasons for that is his ability to sacrifice on behalf of the principles that he held most dear. Couldn't be bought. And I'm praying every day for salvation, because as one street dealer said once, they just haven't quoted your price yet, Reverend. I hope he's wrong. But it's real. And the greatest temptation is to do right for the wrong reason. Now, that's money again. And I wrestle with it every day. So the corporation says, hey, Cal, you know, we're going to build 200 units of housing for the homeless in your community. It'll be state-of-the-art, beautiful. We'll build it, pay prevailing wages. You got it. Thank you very much. That's a nice thing. And we want you to stop, you know, railing against rap music that, that denigrates women, and, you leave that alone. Because if you do, we won't build the housing. I just won't. See, man, you can get the housing built, just shut up. It's a tough thing. And then it's not as cut and dry it's not as easy as that. See, for Americans, what can the individual American person do to show his or her disgust with the ugliness of terrorism? Well, buy a car that gets 40 miles to a gallon of gas. Let's go bomb Afghanistan. Because I'm not willing. I got a price. My price is I want to drive my SUV. This money is a terror.